I used to believe that truth had a sound, that when it arrived, you would hear it coming like thunder in the distance, warning you to brace yourself. I was wrong. Truth doesn't announce itself. It slips in quietly, disguised as an ordinary moment, and by the time you recognize it, everything you thought was solid has already cracked. For me, that moment came on a rainy Wednesday afternoon, 15 years after the lie was first planted, 15 years after my life had been carefully arranged around something that was never real. Back then, my life looked ordinary from the outside. I had a stable job, a modest home, and a family story I had repeated so many times it felt like muscle memory. I wasn't unhappy. That's the part that still haunts me. I wasn't miserable or desperate or suspicious. I was content in a quiet, unremarkable way, the kind of contentment that makes you stop asking questions because everything seems to make sense. I trusted the people closest to me. I trusted the version of my past that had been handed down like an heirloom, polished and rehearsed, never questioned. The woman who handed it to me was my mother, or at least the woman I believed was my mother in every way that mattered. She was calm, composed, the kind of person who spoke softly and chose her words carefully. Growing up, she was the center of my emotional universe, the keeper of our family's history. When she told stories, they were always neat, contained, without loose ends. I never noticed how much effort that must have taken. 15 years earlier, when I was still young enough to accept answers without pushing back, she had made a decision for me. At the time, I thought it was protection. Now I understand it was control. She decided what I was allowed to know and what I was. She decided that the truth would complicate my life, so she replaced it with something simpler, something safer, something easier for her to manage. And for 15 years, I lived inside that replacement without realizing it. The day everything changed didn't start dramatically. There was no argument, no confrontation, no ominous silence. It started with paperwork, boring, bureaucratic paperwork. I was sorting through old documents for a routine administrative process, the kind of task you put off because it feels pointless. Birth certificates, medical records, school forms, things I'd seen before but never really looked at. I wasn't searching for anything. I certainly wasn't searching for the truth. When I came across the document that would undo everything, my first reaction wasn't shock. It was confusion. A quiet, nagging confusion that made me reread the same line over and over, convinced my eyes were playing tricks on me. The names didn't line up. Dates didn't align the way they should have. There was a discrepancy so small that anyone else might have shrugged it off, but something in my chest tightened. My instincts, dormant for years, stirred awake. I remember sitting there, the rain tapping against the window, the room strangely still. My phone was in my hand, but I didn't know who to call or what to ask. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to file the document away and pretend I hadn't seen it. That part was loud, persuasive, almost desperate. But another part, quieter and steadier, refused to let go. It whispered that if I didn't follow this thread now, I would never forgive myself later. If you want the full truth, hit like so this story reaches more people, because stories like this don't survive in silence. I started pulling out more records, older ones no one had asked me to look at before. With every new page, the picture grew less stable. What I had always believed was a straight line began to look like a carefully constructed detour. There were gaps where there shouldn't have been any, signatures that didn't match, addresses I didn't recognize. My heart pounded, not from fear exactly, but from the growing realization that someone had gone to great lengths to curate my reality. The worst part wasn't the evidence itself. It was the memory of all the moments that suddenly felt off in retrospect. The way certain topics were avoided at family gatherings. The way my questions as a teenager were redirected or dismissed. The tension that flickered across my mother's face when someone mentioned the past. At the time, I thought it was normal discomfort. Now I saw it for what it was, vigilance. Constant, exhausting vigilance. I confronted her that evening, though confront feels too aggressive for what actually happened. I asked calmly, too calmly. I told her I had found some inconsistencies and wanted clarification. She listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When I finished, there was a pause that stretched longer than it should have. In that pause, I understood everything before she said a single word. She didn't deny it. That was the first blow. She didn't even pretend to be surprised. Instead, she sighed, as if relieved that the performance was finally over. 15 years of silence collapsed into that one sound. When she spoke, Her voice was steady, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. She told me the truth the same way she had told me bedtime stories when I was a child, as if tone alone could soften the impact. What she revealed wasn't just a hidden fact. It was a complete reframing of my identity. Relationships I thought I understood were suddenly ambiguous. Choices I believed were mine took on a different meaning. The foundation of my life shifted, and with it, my sense of self. I wasn't just learning new information. I was mourning the version of myself that had been built on a lie. She said she did it to protect me. They always say that. She said the truth would have been too heavy, too complicated, too disruptive. She said 15 years ago, she thought she was making the best decision for everyone. What she didn't say, but what hung in the air between us, was that telling the truth would have required her to face consequences she wasn't ready to face. So she chose silence. She chose control. She chose to let me live a life shaped by her fear. I left her house that night feeling like a stranger in my own skin. The rain had stopped, but the world looked different, sharper, less forgiving. Every memory replayed itself with new context, every certainty questioned. I realized then that discovering the truth isn't a single moment. It's a process. A slow, painful unraveling that forces you to decide who you are when the story you believed in no longer holds. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was replaying her words over and over, but because my mind was trying to rebuild a structure that had just collapsed. When a lie lasts 15 years, it doesn't sit in one corner of your life. It spreads. It weaves itself into routines, relationships, assumptions. Pulling it out leaves holes everywhere. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, realizing that every version of myself I remembered had been standing on ground that wasn't solid. The next morning, I went to work as if nothing had happened. That was instinct, not strength. I smiled at people, answered emails, followed procedures, all while carrying a secret that felt heavier than anything I had ever held. No one noticed. That hurt more than I expected. It was proof of how invisible internal earthquakes can be. Your world can end, and the rest of the world will still ask you if you want sugar in your coffee. As the day went on, anger began to seep in, slow and corrosive. Not the explosive kind that makes you shout or throw things, but a quieter rage that sharpens your thoughts. I kept hearing her voice in my head, explaining, justifying, smoothing over 15 years of deception with words like protection and love. The more I replayed it, the clearer it became that what she had protected wasn't me. It was the image she needed to maintain. The family narrative she didn't want questioned. The control she was afraid to lose. By lunchtime, I had made a decision without fully admitting it to myself. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to get them by staying quiet. The problem was, I didn't know who else was involved. Lies like this are rarely a solo act. They require witnesses, accomplices, people who agree not to speak. That meant there were others who had known the truth long before I did, people who had looked me in the eye for years and chosen silence. I started with the safest name on my mental list, someone I trusted enough to risk disappointment. A relative who had always seemed oddly distant, polite but guarded. When I called and asked if we could talk, there was a hesitation on the line that told me everything before the conversation even began. We met later that afternoon, sitting across from each other in a quiet cafe, the kind of place where people lower their voices without realizing why. I didn't accuse. I didn't demand. I simply asked if they knew. The pause that followed was long enough to feel cruel. Then they nodded. That single movement shattered whatever fragile hope I had left that this was an isolated decision made by one person under pressure. It was. It was a collective agreement. A shared secret maintained through years of careful avoidance and half-truths. They told me they had wanted to say something many times, that they had argued about it behind closed doors, that they had convinced themselves it wasn't their place. Listening to them, I felt something inside me harden. Everyone involved had a reason. Fear, loyalty, convenience. What none of them had was an excuse. 15 years isn't a moment of weakness. It's a sustained choice. When I left the cafe, the city felt louder, more aggressive. Every passing conversation sounded like noise layered over my thoughts. I realized that I was no longer just processing a lie. I was processing betrayal by omission. The understanding that the truth had been available, sitting in rooms I had walked into, carried by people who smiled at me and said nothing. By the time evening came, the anger had crystallized into clarity. I wasn't interested in screaming matches or dramatic confrontations. I didn't want apologies delivered too late to matter. What I wanted was ownership, accountability. I wanted the people who had decided my truth for me to understand what that decision had cost. Comment justice if you believe she deserved justice, because silence this long is never harmless. That night I began writing, not a letter to anyone else, but a record for myself. Dates, conversations, moments that now made sense. I needed to see it laid out, not as an emotional blur, but as a sequence of deliberate actions. Writing it down transformed the pain into something structured. It stopped being a storm and started becoming a map. Patterns emerged quickly. Every major decision point in my life coincided with moments where the truth might have surfaced and didn't. Moves that kept me physically distant from people who knew. Career choices subtly influenced by family needs. Relationships that ended abruptly for reasons that never fully added up. None of it was accidental. The lie wasn't just about the past. It had actively shaped my future. The realization that followed was unsettling, but empowering. If the lie had guided my life this much, then the truth had the potential to reshape it just as powerfully. I wasn't obligated to preserve anyone else's comfort anymore. I wasn't responsible for maintaining a story that had cost me 15 years of informed choice. I went back to my mother's house 2 days later. This time, I didn't ask questions. I brought the timeline I had created and placed it on the table between us. I told her I knew who else had known. I told her I understood the mechanisms of the lie. For the first time, her composure cracked, not because she felt guilty, but because she realized control had slipped through her fingers. She cried. She apologized. She told me again that she thought she was doing the right thing. I listened without interrupting, not out of respect, but out of detachment. Something fundamental had shifted. Her words no longer had the power to redefine my reality. When she finished, I told her calmly that intentions don't erase impact, and that love doesn't give anyone the right to rewrite another person's life. Walking away that day felt different from the first time. Lighter, but sharper. I wasn't healed. I wasn't even close. But I had crossed an invisible line. I was no longer a passive recipient of a truth delayed. I was an active participant in what came next. And for the first time since that rainy Wednesday, the future didn't feel like something that had been pre-decided for me. I thought clarity would bring peace, that once the truth was fully exposed, my mind would settle, my emotions would organize themselves into something manageable. Instead, clarity brought momentum. Knowing what had been done to me lit a fuse I didn't know existed. It wasn't about revenge in the dramatic sense. I didn't fantasize about screaming confrontations or public scenes. What grew inside me was something colder and far more focused, the need to reclaim authorship of my own life. For years, my identity had been edited without my consent. Details removed, motivations altered, outcomes redirected. Now that I could finally see the edits, I wanted the uncut version back. That meant more conversations, harder ones, with people who were no longer protected by my ignorance. Each discussion peeled away another layer of the carefully maintained illusion. Some reacted defensively. They insisted they were victims of circumstance, pressured into silence by fear of conflict or family collapse. Others broke down, admitting they had rationalized their complicity by telling themselves I was better off not knowing. That phrase began to feel like a slap. Better off. As if not knowing who you are, where you come from, or why certain doors were closed to you is somehow a kindness. With every confession, my anger became more precise. It stopped being a vague sense of injustice and turned into a ledger. I wasn't keeping score to punish anyone. I was documenting responsibility. Understanding exactly who had made which choices and why was essential. Lies thrive in ambiguity. I was determined to remove it. The most difficult conversation came last. The one I had been avoiding because some part of me still hoped it would be different. When I finally sat across from that person, someone who had been a constant presence in my life, I saw recognition flicker in their eyes before I said a word. They knew why I was there. They had known for 15 years that this moment might come. They didn't deny it. They didn't even try to soften it. They simply said they had been told to stay quiet and had agreed because it was easier. Easier than disrupting the family balance. Easier than facing uncomfortable questions. Easier than dealing with fallout. hearing that stripped the situation down to its raw core. My life-changing truth had been buried for convenience. I walked away from that meeting with a strange sense of calm. Not relief, not satisfaction, but resolve. The pattern was undeniable now. Multiple people, multiple opportunities, the same outcome. Silence chosen over honesty every single time. That wasn't something I could ignore or minimize anymore. Type yes if you want to see all targets hit at once, because moments like this force you to decide whether silence continues or stops with you. That night, I sat alone and asked myself a question that terrified me more than any revelation so far. What happens next? Knowing the truth was only the first step. What I did with it would define the rest of my life. I could keep it contained, process it privately, allow everyone else to move on with minimal disruption. Or I could let the truth exist openly, in the spaces it had been deliberately excluded from. The weight of that decision pressed down on me. I understood the consequences of choosing transparency. Relationships would fracture. Family dynamics would shift permanently. People who had grown comfortable inside the lie would be forced to confront it. There would be anger directed at me for disturbing a peace that was never real to begin with. I knew all of this, and still, the answer felt inevitable. I wasn't responsible for preserving a false harmony. I was responsible for myself. The first step was practical. I gathered documentation, records, messages, written confirmations, not because I expected anyone to challenge me, but because I needed to anchor the truth in something tangible. Gaslighting loses its power when facts are organized. I created a personal archive, a quiet act of self-defense against future denial. As I worked, I noticed something unexpected. My fear began to recede. In its place came a growing sense of agency. For 15 years, decisions had been made for me. Now, every small action felt like a declaration. I chose who to inform. I chose how much to share. I chose when to speak and when to stay silent, and that difference mattered more than I had anticipated. When I finally began telling my story beyond the inner circle, reactions varied wildly. Some people were stunned into silence. Others expressed anger on my behalf that I hadn't yet allowed myself to feel. A few tried to redirect the conversation, urging forgiveness, urging me to consider how hard it must have been for those who lied. I listened, nodded, and declined to absorb that responsibility. Empathy does not require self-erasure. What surprised me most was how many people confided similar experiences once I spoke up. Different details, different contexts, but the same core violation. Truth withheld, choices stolen, lives quietly redirected. It was as if my story had given them permission to name their own. That realization shifted something fundamental in me. This wasn't just personal anymore. It was systemic. A pattern repeated in countless families under the guise of protection and love. The more openly I lived with the truth, the more the old narrative lost its grip. Memories rearranged themselves into a coherent timeline. Doubts I had suppressed for years finally had explanations. Even my instincts, once dismissed as overthinking, felt validated. I hadn't been paranoid or ungrateful. I had been perceptive in an environment designed to make perception inconvenient. There were moments of grief, sharp and sudden. Grief for the years spent navigating a reality that wasn't fully mine. Grief for opportunities I might have chosen differently. Grief for the version of myself that trusted without reservation. I let that grief exist without rushing it away. It deserved space. But grief wasn't the end of the story. Beneath it, something stronger took root. Confidence, not the loud kind, but the quiet assurance that comes from knowing yourself without filters. For the first time, my life felt authored, not edited by committee. And that realization carried a promise. Whatever came next would be chosen, not assigned. Once the truth stopped being a secret, the world reacted in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. Some people leaned in closer, curious, supportive, almost protective. Others pulled away, suddenly uncomfortable around me, as if honesty were contagious. I learned quickly who preferred peace built on lies and who could tolerate discomfort in exchange for reality. That distinction alone reshaped my social universe. Family gatherings became tense. Conversations felt staged, overly polite, like everyone was waiting for something to explode. I refused to play my old role. I no longer laughed at jokes that made my stomach tighten or nodded through stories that conveniently skipped entire chapters. When silence fell, I let it fall. When questions came, I answered them truthfully, without embellishment or cruelty. The truth didn't need drama to be effective. It carried its own weight. There were attempts to reframe what had happened, to soften it, to suggest that maybe the lie hadn't been so damaging after all. I noticed how often people focused on outcomes instead of principles. You turned out fine. You're successful. You're stable. As if the absence of visible ruin somehow justified the theft of autonomy. I began to understand how deeply people fear accountability. It's easier to measure harm by visible wreckage than by unseen detours. Privately, the internal work intensified. I questioned my instincts, my preferences, even my memories. How much of who I was had been shaped by choices I might not have made with full information? That question was both unsettling and liberating. It meant parts of my life were open to revision, not because they were wrong, but because they were finally mine to reconsider. I started small, decisions that seemed trivial but carried symbolic weight. I changed routines I'd followed for years simply because they had been expected of me. I explored interests I'd once dismissed as impractical or indulgent. Each choice was a quiet rebellion against a past that had been curated without my consent. Each one reminded me that agency isn't reclaimed in a single grand gesture, but through hundreds of small, deliberate acts. At times, guilt crept in, not because I had done anything wrong, but because I had disrupted a system that relied on my compliance. People who benefit from your silence rarely thank you when you find your voice. I had to unlearn the reflex to smooth things over, to apologize for discomfort that wasn't mine to manage. That process was harder than confronting the lie itself. Share this video so communities understand what was hiding, because silence only protects the people who created it. The shift became most evident in my relationship with my mother. Distance grew where familiarity once lived. Our conversations became careful, measured, stripped of the warmth that had defined them for decades. She tried, in her own way, to regain influence. Advice offered too freely, worry framed as concern. But the dynamic had changed irrevocably. I listened without yielding. Love without honesty no longer felt safe to me. There were moments when I wondered if this transformation had cost me too much. Old comfort replaced by constant awareness. Familiarity traded for clarity. But every time doubt surfaced, I returned to a simple truth. Comfort built on deception is not peace. It's sedation. And waking up, no matter how disorienting, is always preferable to sleepwalking through someone else's version of your life. As months passed, the story stopped feeling raw. It became integrated, no longer an open wound but a scar that reminded me of what I had survived. I noticed how differently I navigated relationships. I asked better questions. I paid attention to inconsistencies instead of dismissing them. Trust, once automatic, became intentional. That shift didn't make me cynical. It made me discerning. Unexpectedly, the experience sharpened my empathy. Not the passive kind that excuses harm, but the active kind that recognizes how easily people can justify wrongdoing when it serves their fears. I saw how generational patterns repeat themselves under the banner of protection. How secrets become traditions. How silence is inherited. Breaking that cycle required more than anger. It required endurance. I began speaking publicly about my experience, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. Not to shame anyone, but to articulate something many people feel and struggle to name. The response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from strangers who had lived with half-truths, withheld histories, and carefully managed narratives. They thanked me not for the details, but for the permission to question. Each message reinforced what I had come to believe. Truth has a ripple effect. When one person refuses to carry a lie, it weakens the structures that depend on collective silence. That realization reframed my pain into purpose. The years lost to deception couldn't be reclaimed, but they could be repurposed into something that mattered beyond me. I no longer measured my progress by how little it hurt. I measured it by how honestly I lived. There were still difficult days, moments when grief resurfaced unexpectedly. But there were also moments of profound alignment, when my actions matched my values without negotiation. Those moments felt like freedom. Looking back, I understand now that the lie wasn't the most damaging part. The most damaging part was being denied the right to choose how to respond to the truth. Taking that right back changed everything. It didn't make life easier. It made it real. And real, I learned, is where strength actually lives. As time went on, the intensity of the revelation faded, but its implications grew sharper. The shock had been loud and immediate, but the long-term consequences were quieter, more deliberate. I began to see how the lie had functioned not as a single act, but as a system designed to keep everyone in their assigned place. My place had been that of the compliant one, the one who didn't ask too many questions, the one who made things easier for others by not insisting on clarity. That realization changed how I saw power. It isn't always exercised through force or threats. Sometimes it looks like concern. Sometimes it sounds like reassurance. Sometimes it hides behind phrases like, "We did this for your own good." For 15 years, I had mistaken control for care because I had been taught to. Unlearning that lesson took effort, and it took time. I noticed how often people tried to rush me toward forgiveness, as if forgiveness were a finish line you cross to prove emotional maturity. They spoke about moving on, about letting go, about not dwelling on the past. What they didn't understand was that forgiveness without accountability is just another form of erasure. I wasn't interested in pretending the damage hadn't happened so others could feel more comfortable. Instead, I focused on integration, allowing the truth to coexist with my present without dominating it. That meant acknowledging anger without being ruled by it, allowing grief without letting it define me. I stopped framing my experience as something that happened to me and started recognizing how I was actively responding to it. That shift was subtle, but it marked the difference between surviving and reclaiming. There were setbacks, days when a random comment or an old photograph reopened wounds I thought had healed. Moments when I questioned whether speaking up had been worth the disruption it caused. In those moments, I reminded myself of the alternative. A life lived inside a lie doesn't stay stable forever. It collapses eventually, usually in ways far more destructive than honesty ever could be. My relationships continued to evolve. Some grew stronger, anchored by mutual respect and transparency. Others fell away quietly, unable to withstand the absence of pretense. I grieved those losses, too, but without regret. Connections that require silence to survive were never truly secure to begin with. The most profound change happened internally. I stopped editing myself. I expressed disagreement without apology. I set boundaries without lengthy explanations. I trusted my perceptions instead of immediately questioning them. These weren't dramatic acts. They were practical ones, and they accumulated into something transformative. Each choice reinforced the understanding that my life belonged to me, fully and unapologetically. If this shocked you, comment truth below, because stories like this exist everywhere, hidden behind polite smiles and carefully managed silence. I also became more aware of how easily lies can be passed down, how one generation's fear becomes the next generation's confusion. The temptation to withhold difficult truths in the name of protection is powerful. I felt it myself at times, in unrelated situations, and that awareness kept me vigilant. Transparency isn't always kind in the moment, but deception is never kind in the long run. The lie that shaped my life for 15 years didn't make me stronger on its own. What strengthened me was the decision to face it fully, without minimizing its impact or inflating my own resilience. I allowed myself to be angry. I allowed myself to be sad. And then I allowed myself to move forward without carrying other people's guilt. One of the most unexpected outcomes was the way my story resonated with others. People I barely knew shared their own experiences of withheld truths, family secrets, and carefully curated realities. There was a pattern in their words. The pain wasn't just about what had been hidden. It was about the lost opportunity to choose differently, to consent, to participate in their own lives with full awareness. Hearing those stories reinforced my resolve. Silence doesn't protect families, it protects dysfunction. And truth, even when it disrupts, creates the possibility for something healthier to exist in its place. That understanding became a guiding principle for me. I no longer aimed for harmony at any cost. I aimed for honesty with integrity. Looking ahead, I stopped asking myself how to return to who I was before. That person existed inside a carefully controlled narrative. Instead, I asked who I wanted to become now that the narrative was mine to write. The answer wasn't fixed or final. It didn't need to be. What mattered was that the choice was real. I don't romanticize what happened. 15 years of truth withheld is a profound violation. It altered my trajectory in ways I'll never fully measure. But I also don't define myself by that violation anymore. I define myself by the clarity that followed, by the boundaries I built, and by the refusal to accept half-truths as a substitute for respect. In the end, the day I found out didn't just change my life. It gave it back to me. Not in perfect condition, not without scars, but intact enough to rebuild on my own terms. And that, more than anything, is what makes the truth worth facing, no matter how long it's been hidden. By the time a full year had passed, the truth no longer felt like an intruder in my life. It had settled in, not comfortably, but honestly. I stopped measuring time in before and after and started measuring it in alignment. Did my choices reflect what I now knew? Did my relationships reflect who I actually was? Those questions became my compass, and for the first time, they pointed in a direction that felt unmistakably mine. I no longer waited for permission to exist as myself. I spoke when something felt wrong. I stepped back when something felt manipulative. I stopped trying to manage other people's reactions to my boundaries. That was their work, not mine. The quiet confidence that grew from that decision surprised me. It wasn't loud or performative. It was steady, rooted, unshakable. Occasionally, people would still try to rewrite the story. They'd say things like, "It wasn't meant to hurt you," or "It all worked out in the end." I learned to hear those comments for what they were, attempts to reduce discomfort. I didn't argue anymore. I didn't need to. The truth didn't require defense once I stopped doubting it myself. My relationship with my past softened, too. Not because I excused what was done, but because I stopped letting it define every corner of my present. I could acknowledge the loss without living inside it. I could honor the pain without building an identity around it. Healing, I learned, wasn't about forgetting. It was about integrating without surrendering your power. There were moments of gratitude I never expected. Gratitude for the resilience I discovered. Gratitude for the clarity that replaced confusion. Gratitude even for the discomfort that forced me to grow beyond the version of myself that accepted less than I deserved. None of this justified the lie, but it reminded me that I was more than the damage it caused. When I look back now, what strikes me most isn't how long the truth was hidden, but how quickly everything changed once it surfaced. One revelation dismantled a carefully constructed illusion and made space for something real. That's the part people underestimate. Truth doesn't just take things away. It gives you options. It hands you the pen and steps back. The day I found out changed my life forever, not because it destroyed it, but because it stripped it down to something honest. From there, rebuilding wasn't an act of desperation. It was an act of intention. Every choice since then has carried the quiet satisfaction of knowing it's informed, conscious, and mine. If you've listened to this and felt something shift inside you, don't ignore it. Like this video, so stories like this keep reaching the people who need them. In the comments, tell me honestly, do you think the truth should ever be hidden for protection? Or does it always do more harm in the end? And subscribe to this channel if you want more real stories about hidden truths, personal awakenings, and the strength it takes to reclaim your life. Because sometimes hearing someone else's story is what gives you the courage to face your own.